Now I'm sure most of you will agree with what I'm about to say, but Elden Ring has the largest pool of weapons that are considered overpowered. With hundreds and hundreds of weapons available with multiple scaling factors, it's a recipe that literally allows you to pick up any weapon in the game and turn it into something incredible. And that got me thinking, what truly is the best weapon for each one of those scaling factors? So today we're going to have a look at the best scaling weapon for strength, dexterity, intelligence, faith, and arcane. So obviously make sure you stay tuned, and if you enjoy this video at any point, if you don't mind me asking if you leave that like rating down below as well, that helps me out a bunch and lets me know that you want to see more videos just like this one. And of course, if you're new around here or you find yourself coming back to the channel to watch these kinds of videos, make sure that you're subscribed, and then that way you can stay up to date with all of the Elden Ring content. But with all of that said, let's obviously just jump straight into the content. So of course, we're going to be starting things off going from top to bottom, so as they appear in like the stats list, if you will, in Elden Ring. So we're going to be kicking things off with the strength stat. What is objectively the best weapon you can use, revolving purely around the strength stat? Of course, there's a lot of contenders for that kind of title, especially ones that have an S scaling in strength once you fully upgrade them, so things like the Ruin's Greatsword, the Giant Crusher, even just the regular Greatsword is of course a fantastic strength weapon that you can use. But there is one particular Greatsword that I feel gets overlooked, especially when you talk about strength, and that weapon in question being Maria's Executioner. And listen, before you click off the video and bin this off and write in the comments about how this isn't a Unga Bunga build, its actual best scaling stat is in fact strength, and it is still a greatsword where you can technically do the standard caveman strat of just smacking your enemies around the head with it. But the unique thing about this weapon, and the reason why it has to be mentioned and has to be up here, is because especially in the later game and also the new game pluses, the amount of damage that you can do with the skill power, the Eocade's Dancing Blade, is just astronomically more than what you will ever do with any other colossal weapon. Typically, buffs like Royal Knight's Resolve and other general weapons like the Ruin's Greatsword do thousands of damage, but I'm actually going to put up on screen a side by side of a Giant Crusher with Royal Knight's Resolve and all of the buffs in strength, charged attacks, all that goodness, compared to the Maria's Executioner just using the Ash of War. This is footage from New Game Plus 6, and it's very easy to see that the Maria's Executioner is just so much easier to use, and it's so much more deadly, and therefore is so much better compared to the rest of the strength scaling weapons. Also, this skill is transferable over to PvP, mainly because you can either quick release or charge up the Ash of War to switch up the timings of your attacks in your fights. It's very versatile. You can also just use the weapon itself to deal thousands of damage, meaning there's all sorts of different ways to use this weapon and annihilate both PvE and PvP fights. And if you're interested and want to get your hands on this weapon, all you need to do is defeat the Briar boss that is located in the Shaded Castle area. Shaded Castle is towards the north of the Altus Plateau area. It's relatively easy to get to, but the boss himself will be holding this weapon, which can be a bit of a pain to take on, but once you do defeat that boss, he will then drop you that sword, and you will have a whale of a time once you use it for yourself. So, the Maria's Executioner is better in damage, speed, versatility, and is relatively easy to obtain, so for those reasons alone, it had to be the best strength scaling weapon that you can get in Elden Ring. Of course, that's just my opinion though, and with this weapon, along with the rest that we'll speak about, if you want to let me know if you agree or disagree, do obviously let me know in the comments as you're going along, or feel free to wait until the end to get the full list and then tell me how badly wrong I am. But I'm sure that we can agree that the Maria's Executioner is an incredibly powerful weapon and is deserved to be recognized as so. But now that we've delved into the strength weapon, now let's move on to dexterity. Also, I'm not going to bore you by saying this with every single scaling stat because it's true, there are many different dexterity weapons that you can use in the game, much like the vast array of katanas, daggers, pole blades. There are multiple different weapons that could be considered the best if you use them correctly. But of course, there is one in my eyes that trumps every other weapon by quite some distance actually. And that weapon for this category has to be the Bolt of Gransax. Again, another weapon that you can pick up relatively mid-game because you can only get it once you reach the capital of Lionel, and spoiler alert, you need to do it before you turn it into the capital of Ash, where you can basically follow this path after defeating Godfrey's Phantom to then go down the lift, defeat a couple of enemies down there if you want to, or maybe just sneak past them, to then jump over this particular railing to basically drop down down on a much larger scale version of the weapon itself, because it's being held by that dragon that has crashed into the capital. And then just pretty much work your way up the weapon spine, and the actual bolt of Grand Sax will be there ready for you to pick it up. And then once you do so, you've got one of the best thrusting weapons in the game with one of the highest ranges, especially when you use the Ash of War. The Ancient Lightning Spear is a very powerful Ash of War that can be used to literally snipe any enemy at a ridiculous range. So if you're struggling with the game and you're finding yourself getting caught out by certain bosses and you just want a weapon to basically keep your distance and deal a butt ton of damage at the same time, then this is your answer to that. Again, much like the Maria's Executioner's Sword, this skill power can also be charged or quick release to adapt your timings, especially in a PvP sense, so when people are trying to time your attacks and judge whether or not you're going to throw it early or later, you can mix it up and catch them off guard. Again, like I say, it is one of the longest thrusting weapons in the game as well, so even in just general PvP, without using any Ashes of Wars, you will still have a large range, giving you that advantage as you can just poke and prod your enemies to death. But coming back to a PvE sense, it's possibly one of the most cheesiest weapons in the game, because as I said earlier, all you need to do is effectively sit at the very end of the boss arena and just press your Ash of War button to snipe your enemies, dealing anywhere between 2 to 2,500 damage at one time, all while staggering your enemies as well and potentially breaking their stances, and even against enemies that are, say, resistant to lightning damage and ancient dragon effects, the bolt will still actually knock them over. A good example of this is of course the Crucible Knights, where you're not going to be doing the 2,000 damage, maybe only 1,000 or so, but you can just literally sit there, spam them, because they're not going to be able to get up as you're just constantly bowling them over with a massive spear of lightning. Because we're hurling said lightning at our enemies, it also means that we can target a lot of headshots, so this is useful for bigger enemies such as dragons, and usually means you can take them down a lot earlier, as you'll also be getting the extra damage for a headshot, and realistically you can complete the game blindfolded, because it is just literally lock onto your enemy, press your Ash of War button, rinse and repeat until they're dead. And for the fact that you can cheese the entire game this way, it's kind of hard to say that this isn't the best weapon, because ultimately this just turns Elden Ring into an absolute joke. But as much as I say that this weapon makes Elden Ring a joke, the weapon that we have in the intelligence spot makes it a complete mockery. So let's just jump straight into intelligence. If I'm being completely honest, intelligence-based weapons are probably the most powerful in the entire game, especially when you come to realise it includes things like the Darkmoon Greatsword, Moonveil, Sword of Night and Flame, Royal's Greatsword. I could literally go on for days describing how good intelligence weapons are in Elden Ring, but I don't have to, because there is one king of all kings. In fact, this weapon is the best weapon that you can pick up in the entire game, let alone in the intelligence stat, and that weapon has to be the Death's Poker. Now, I probably don't need to introduce this to many people, but for those of you that don't know, this weapon is literally the most broken weapon in the game. I mean, just look at it. Just look at the numbers you can do with this weapon. It is ridiculous. The reason that those sort of numbers are possible are because of its insanely unique Ash of War, the Ghost Flame Ignition, where essentially you set up a ball of Ghost Flame in front of you and you can either hit it with a heavy attack or a light attack. The specific one that we're focusing on is the light attack, as that leaves a trail of that Ghost Flame damage, which can then be stacked multiple times and lasts for about 5 seconds, which allows you to basically do loads of ticks of damage very, very quickly, and Ghost Flame also freezes your enemies. So the initial use will stagger your enemies as you hit them with a Ghost Flame explosion, continue to do ticks of damage over time, and then also proc Frost, and then you'll be able to do even more damage because their defense has been lowered. It is literally a recipe for disaster, and I know some of you may be a little bit angry at this because it's not the best intelligence scaling weapon. In fact, it's a greatsword that focuses purely on strength and dexterity, but where I'm going to be mainly getting around that by saying you only need to use the Ash of War, and the Ash of War is the thing that scales with intelligence, this weapon, or this attack I should say, is the best intelligence scaling attack that you can use in Elden Ring. I mean, it just obliterates everything. You could also argue that the other weapons, especially something like the Darkmoon Greatsword, could potentially be doing more damage or more useful, especially with its Ash of War doing that charged wave of damage, which can also break enemy stances really quickly. But what I would say, by the time that you use the Darkmoon Greatsword to hit your enemies 2 or 3 times to break their stances, you would have been able to beat the boss 3 times over by the time you defeat the boss once with the Darkmoon Greatsword. Now, I must say, in a PvP sense, it's maybe not the best, because obviously players can see that line of Ghost Flame damage, and they're probably a bit more intelligent than the NPCs in PvE, but you can still also use the heavy attack, which does an AoE effect instead of doing that line of Ghost Flame damage, to basically switch it up, deal damage, and you can obviously just use the sword itself. But in all reality, the Ghost Flame Ignition is the thing that we're talking about here, and when it's so broken and does so much damage, it's very hard to say that it's not the best weapon in the game, let alone the best intelligence weapon in the game, and therefore it has to be included here. And for those of you wondering how you get your hands on such an insane weapon, all you need to do is head over to the southeast of Caelid, more specifically to this exact location, and you need to make sure that you come here at night. That is because we are relying on a Deathrite bird to spawn in, and they only spawn in at night time, which we will then defeat to get our hands on the Death's Poker ourselves. So yes, you do need to defeat the Deathrite bird. It is again a little bit challenging, but once you defeat that challenge, you will have the best weapon that the game has to offer. But as much as this weapon isn't too much of a debate, because it's just a given, it's so good, the weapon that we have in our Faith slot might be a little bit more of a debate, so let's jump over there right now. Again, as we know, Faith also has an abundance of incredible weapons. I mean, you got things like the Blasphemous Blade, Malekith's Black Blade, the Black Knife, Sacred Relic Sword, again, the list goes on. But there's one weapon that I think is the best out of the lot, and I'm sort of predicting I might cause a bit of a stir with this, because you might be expecting me to choose something like the Blasphemous Blade. I mean, it's very good, obviously has the health regen as well, but for me personally, especially when you dual wield this weapon, the Magma Blade is the best Faith weapon that you can use. And listen, hear me out, I know this is going to cause a bit of controversy, okay? The reason why I believe this weapon doesn't get as much love as it does is because it's one of the hardest weapons to obtain. In order to get this weapon, there are only 2 NPCs in the entire game that can drop this weapon. Plus, the drop rate of it is 0.5. Of course, you can improve those odds with discovery boosting items, but even still, your percentage is going to be around about the 2% mark, even with everything equipped and max arcane. And the enemy you need to kill is actually inside Volcano Manor, more specifically around the Temple of Eagle. I will show you the farm on screen as I'm talking about it, but there are 2 Man Serpent NPCs that hold this weapon, and you have to farm these 2. So if they don't drop it, you have to reset the entire farm, which takes around about a minute to fully complete. Because it's a little bit of an ag, not many people tend to farm this weapon, but what I will say is if you do eventually get it to drop, it is a very powerful Faith weapon. It is the first curved sword on this list, and it has a unique Ash of War, the Magma Shower, that basically turns you into a magma spewing Beyblade. It also does a tremendous amount of poise damage, and obviously leaves that lava on the floor around you, giving you a little bit of protection in an AoE sense as well. But the caveat with this, and what I would suggest doing, is trying to get 2 of them so you've got the dual wield curved sword attacking moves. This will allow you to utilize the jump slash and the running slashes, which basically does a flurry of attacks doing around about 4 or 5, dealing an absolute butt ton of damage, to which you can then follow up with that Ash of War to do a load of poise damage, allowing you to absolutely rinse your enemy's health bars and destroy most things that you come across. Again, fire damage is good against pretty much everybody bar the Elden Beast, so you're still going to be doing thousands of damage in very quick succession, especially if you're utilizing the Ash of War. It is by far one of the strongest curve swords in the game bar using bleed, and is very useful in a PvP sense as well, as you can essentially leave the lava on the floor, chase your enemies down and defeat them very quickly with the curved sword attacks, and just be very quick and nimble, just causing absolute havoc throughout the lands between. And yes, I know obviously things like the Blasphemous Blade, the Sacred Relic Sword have a tremendous sort of like reach and can possibly do more damage per hit, but in reality the DPS on this kind of weapon is insane, and it makes up for the fact that you're not doing a heavy amount of damage with each singular hit, and it's just a bit more versatile, quicker to use, while still doing similar levels of damage, which for me just pips it above the rest of the faith weapons in the game. Now I'm going to die on the hill for this sword, but I know that is not everyone's favourite and not everybody has used it, so specifically maybe for the faith weapon, let me know what you would put as the best faith weapon in the game, because for me it's definitely the magma blade, but I can see obviously arguments for things like the blasphemous blade, things like the black knife, because those kind of weapons are also extremely powerful and unique in their own right as well. But with that cop out the way, we've got one final stat that we need to talk about, and that of course is Arcane. So let's just jump straight into it. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, I was having a little bit of a to and fro as to how I can dictate the best arcane weapon. As you probably know, you can apply certain Ashes of Wars to certain weapons, so I was thinking whether or not to take into account the occult versions of weapons that basically mean any weapon can become a high scaling arcane weapon, but I thought just to keep things simple and obviously as fair as physically possible, just only include the weapons that already have a decent arcane scaling. So things like the Rivers of Blood, Morgwyn's Spear, and so on. And so with that caveat in mind, the best scaling arcane weapon that I believe you can use in Elden Ring is in fact Eleonora's Pole Blade. The actual damage output with this thing is just crazy. Of course, when talking about Arcane, we have to also discuss Morgwyn's Spear, and although that weapon has been nerfed since the game first released, it still does pack an absolute punch with its Ritual Spear, and although that can affect multiple enemies at one time, realistically, against most high-end bosses, that weapon isn't the strongest. And one weapon that does shine through against mobile enemies is in fact Eleonora's Pole Blade. This is effectively two Rivers of Blood stitched together and allows you to do a whirlwind of blood-spilling attacks, slicing through your enemies about 10 times in quick succession. Pole Blades are also just one of the quickest attacking weapons in general, just with their light attacks and heavy attacks, so mixing the fact that you've got the Ash of War that turns you into a helicopter blade, also having a similar move to say the Bloodhound step, where you go forwards dealing the attack and then back out to keep a safe distance so you don't get hit straight away after using it, it's very, very versatile and very, very good to use. Much like every other weapon in this list so far, it also does a tremendous amount of poise damage given that it's a pole blade, and typically after 2 full uses of the Ash of War, you will then stun your enemies, allowing you to critical hit them, and you would have possibly triggered the bleed effect that comes with this weapon once or twice in that as well. The caveat with this is that skill power is good against every single enemy and does that poise damage again against most enemies as well. So you're not just relying on the bleed damage to carry this weapon, it does actually physically do quite a bit of damage as well. So where you would think it would fall off being heavily around bleed, where say Morgwyn's Spear falls off if you're coming up against someone who's resistant to that, the Eleonora's Pole Blade is still a good option against any enemy. It's also a weapon that you can probably get at the earliest stage out of everything that we've discussed so far, because all you need to do is complete Yura's questline, and there's 2 ways of doing that, either following him throughout the Limgrave areas and the Lake of Lernia to complete his actual quest, or if you go to the mountain top of the giants where Yura becomes Shibiri, that also triggers the end of his quest because he's effectively died, and therefore that completes, in quotation mark, the quest because it no longer exists, to which then you can go to the second church of Marika, located in the Altus Plateau, to go and fight Eleonora when she invades you. Again, defeat Eleonora and you get this pole blade, and you've got one of the most fun and powerful pole blades that the game has to offer. Of course, just to answer the question as if we were including weapons that you can infuse certain Ashes of War onto, it would be very similar in the fact that we might have been talking about the Scavenger's Curve Swords, where that has a natural bleed affinity. Just adding Arcane onto that as well just means you'll be doing 100+ bleed proc, and if you dual wield them and make use of the dual curve sword moves, you're basically going to trigger the bleed effect every 1 or 2 seconds. But where we're scrapping that because that's a very obvious answer, and then you can also delve into other weapons that do exactly the same thing, just for a weapon that naturally busts with Arcane, Eleonora's Pole Blade is possibly the best out of the bunch. And essentially, those are the 5 weapons that I believe are the best that you can use for each stat in Elden Ring. Of course, as I said throughout the video, feel free to comment down below if you agree with any of these, or if you feel that one should definitely be in here which hasn't featured. I'm more than happy to have the discussions with you in the comments, and I'm always intrigued to know what you guys are using, what you think is best. So yeah, make sure you get down there and let me know. Also, whilst you're down there, if I have shown you any weapons that you're interested in using, or maybe you haven't seen before and you want to know a bit more about them, I do have singular videos around each and every one of these weapons that we've discussed on the channel, so I'll leave links in the description to the singular videos for each weapon, so you can go over there, check out the best build around that specific weapon to get the most out of it and have the most fun using it in your games. But realistically, other than that, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody that has watched this video and has also been supporting my channel recently. You guys seem to love the previous video, obviously looking at the DLC news and things like that, and we're having a bit of a switch up in content around the channel, so I really do hope that you're enjoying this kind of video as well. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you for the support so far. Obviously, we're going into 2024 with just over 12,000 subscribers, and the end goal is to maybe jump that up to 20,000. Possibly 25. So if you are new around here or find yourself coming back to this channel and realize that you're not subscribed, make sure that you are subscribed, because we're bringing the absolute best Elden Ring content for you guys. But yeah, other than just reminding you guys that you're absolute legends and I can't thank you enough, I believe I've said everything that I need to say, guys. So go and enjoy these weapons, have an absolute blast with them. Let me know how you get on, of course, but in the meantime, I guess I'll catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.